welcome to the the final presentation. Okay, red light live. Am I supposed to read all this to the people? Okay, I got the word. We're set to go. Again, welcome to the Newton Historical Society's final presentation for 2019. My name is Bill Landry. I am president of the society, and I want to welcome you all here this evening. This evening's program is entitled 13 Days in October, The Untold Cuban Missile Crisis Story. And looking around, I think most of you can probably relate and remember when this happened. I, of course, was only a teenager, but I'm sure some of you were a little older. Our presenter this evening is Michael Tugas, and Michael is a graduate of St. Michael's College. He is a lecturer and award-winning best-selling author and co-author of 30 books. Before I turn the microphone over to Michael, though, we have to go through our usual housekeeping items. The exits, I guess everybody came in through the one to the right of the stage. In addition to that one, you can also go through the swinging doors, down a couple of flights, and out the front door. Restrooms, through the swinging doors again, there's one on the right. If you go downstairs to the main lobby, there are two gender-specific down there. Cell phones. Who has a cell phone? Please turn them off or put them on silent so we won't interrupt Michael's very exciting and interesting program this evening. The program is broadcast on TV this evening. Right now it's being broadcast, and it will be rebroadcast periodically over the next few weeks or so. Finally, donations. We have our donation box, as usual, over there in the corner, right next to the booklets from our 250th anniversary. If you haven't taken the booklet yet, please feel free to take one. Ignore the $10 charge on there. That's the kind of organization we are. As we always do, I should say, not usually, we always do with programs sponsored by the New Hampshire Humanities Council. Whatever we collect in donations, the society matches that amount, and we turn it over to the Newton Food Pantry. Right, Brian? So, without any further delay, I give you Michael Tugas.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming. The program you're going to see is a little different than the normal author talk, where I'd like you to pretend you're watching a movie with me, and I'm narrating and giving you some of the behind-the-scenes research. The reason I took on this particular project was I did not know that we had a casualty during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I always thought it ended peacefully, no one died, but it came as a surprise, and I said, I need to give this gentleman more attention. And then during the research, I discovered 4 lesser-known incidents that had us a whisker away from nuclear war. And I was like, why wasn't I taught this in high school? But maybe some of it's because many of the documents were classified and now they're declassified. But for whatever the reason, they'll probably come as a surprise to you folks as well. And normally the books that I write are about true rescue at sea stories. Before I show you a couple, I have The next newsletter will come out in October, and I usually announce what it is I'm working on, and lately it's books for what they call middle readers, aged 9 to 14, and I've got a series with Macmillan. It's called the True Rescue series. So in this newsletter, I'll be talking about this new series coming up. And the last book I did on these ocean rescues is called So Close to Home, and this is about the first German U-boat that came over to the United States, past Florida, went all the way through the Gulf of Mexico to the mouth of the Mississippi River, and sank a family who was on board a freighter. So there were 62 people on board this freighter and just one family. And at first I thought the story would be their survival at sea story, because the little 8-year-old boy is now in his 80s and alive and well, living in Quincy, Mass. So I was able to interview him. But during the course of the research, we found the U-boat commander's war diary at the National Archives. So all of a sudden we could see things from the U-boat commander's perspective. And so the chapters alternate between what the family's doing to survive in the ocean, and they're all split apart, by the way, and what's happening on board the U-boat. And it takes you through this period. So that book's called So Close to Home, and I ordered 1,000 copies, and I can no longer get my car in the garage. So this book is half price. So this little section over here, I've got all 30 of my books here. This section is the half price table. And also over here is a book by the hero of The Finest Hours. Has anybody seen that movie? It's a Disney movie based on the book I wrote by the same name. And it's every author's dream to have a movie made. And Disney did a great job, so you can get it on Netflix now. And I would say probably 80% of the book is, the movie is accurate. They stayed pretty close to the true events. It's about a rescue off Cape Cod in 1952, known as the Coast Guard's greatest and most daring rescue. And then, because I write all these serious topics, I like to mix it up. And I wrote a book called There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse. And the subtitle is The Vermont Misadventures of a Mountain Man Wannabe. It's a little bit like Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods, where I'm trying to live like a mountain man at this remote cabin in Vermont in my early 20s, and everything goes wrong. And so this book combines humor with natural history, so you kind of learn through my mistakes. And after all these years, by the way, I still own the cabin. And it still has the outhouse, but the porcupines no longer live there. So so what I'll do with the presentation, I'll take you through, again, like I say, it's going to be like a movie, and then at the very end, open it up for 2 or 3 questions. And a lot of times people want to share stories at the end as well. So while I'm doing the book signing, we'll take more question and comments. But it's kind of rapid fire with the slides, so that's, again, that feel of a documentary. And then I'm going to, okay, the lights are good, so we're going to get ready, and off we go. A U-2 spy plane, I had no idea what it was, but it's an aircraft designed to fly 13 miles above the Earth. So it's so high up, over 70,000 feet, that Soviet MiGs can't get up there and shoot it down. But you might recall Gary Powers was shot down over Russia in 1960, so we do know that Soviet surface-to-air missiles can reach these. So while the aircraft can't, the missiles could. And I call it a glider on steroids because it's very lightweight, very fragile, but can go at incredible speeds. And its main purpose is to take photographs. There's no weapons on board. And if you fly one of these, it's a high-risk job, because if you were to lose air pressure in the cockpit, your blood would boil within 60 seconds because you're so high up in the stratosphere. So they would wear these pressure suits and a helmet so that theoretically, if you lose air pressure in the cockpit, the pressure suit will inflate and it'll mimic the air pressure here on Earth and hopefully keep you alive till you can land this thing. But during the testing of these, so many pilots perished. And the CIA developed this aircraft, and they would take pilots from the Air Force, and they'd take only the very best pilots, because it took a certain kind of person to be able to be up in the air for maybe 6-7 hours all alone. There is no co-pilot, with complete radio silence, 13 miles high. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't have to remind you folks, but you have these two nuclear superpowers with more nuclear weapons than you could ever count. So the stakes are so high, it's frightening even today to think about it. A little bit of history before the crisis. You have Castro overthrowing Batista, and we may have made the mistake of not trying to work with Castro in the first month or two when that happened. But at any rate, we were trying to get rid of Castro from day one. In fact, Bobby Kennedy was head of an operation called Mongoose to assassinate Castro. And then we backed the invasion called the Bay of Pigs. And although that was a disaster and so many of the invaders were either killed or captured, when I look back on it, I think it might have been a blessing in disguise because it happened under Kennedy's watch, and he learned so much from this. The idea was hatched under the Eisenhower administration, but Kennedy's the one who executed it, and he made a number of mistakes. But the good news from my perspective is he learned from those mistakes. So then when the Cuban Missile Crisis comes about, he's looking back, what do I have to do differently so we don't have this terrible debacle of the Bay of Pigs? The Soviets begin their military buildup in Cuba. We know about it. We don't know about the nuclear weapons until Steve Heiser, that if I go back 2 slides, that's him. He's the one who discovered the nuclear missiles. And he did so on October 14th. And so that launches the 13 days, culminating in what is known as Black Saturday, October 27th. And that's kind of the key of the book, when everything goes wrong. So I thought when I'd research Khrushchev, I'd find that he was kind of this mercurial character. Remember, he took his shoe off and pounded on, I think, the podium. Maybe I'll try it later. But in my research, I realized this guy was shrewd. He served in World War II, came up through the ranks of the Politburo, and believe it or not, his son, Sergei, is alive and well living in Rhode Island. So I was able to interview Sergei, who was old enough at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis to have conversations with his father. So I weave some of what they talked about into Above and Beyond. And one thing that struck me is Sergei said, my father's big fear while this was going on was that somebody on the ground would have a different agenda and do something without my dad's authorization. And I remember saying, boy, that's really kind of odd that you would say that, because that was Kennedy's #1 concern, too. He said to Bobby, my biggest concern is a misunderstanding or some kind of screw-up on the ground, and this thing gets out of control. And both of them were right. That's exactly what happens. So besides being, a nuclear threat, a missile from Cuba could reach Washington, D.C., missiles, I should say, could reach Washington, D.C. in under 10 minutes. But Kennedy viewed it as a political threat. He said, I'll be impeached if I don't get these missiles out of there. And he was right about that. So from the get-go, when he learns about the missiles, his #1 goal is to get them out of there, and that's non-negotiable. The missiles have to go. I learned about Cuba in my research. I didn't know what a big island it is. It's 780 miles across. I never knew where Guantanamo Bay was. I didn't know where the Bay of Pigs happened. So, again, I'm writing this book for the general public, not for the people that are really into the Cuban Missile Crisis, or not for the people that are necessarily in the military. And next I'm going to introduce you to the 4 or 5 main characters of the book. So the first is Jerry McElmore, one of the U-2 pilots, and Jerry was the youngest of the group. He's only 31 years old, and was very accomplished, and later became a brigadier general. So you could see how bright this guy was. So Jerry's one of the main characters you'll get to know. His boss was Major Rudy Anderson. Rudy served in the Korean War, but he didn't want to kill people. He was kind of a pacifist without saying it. So he would always volunteer for reconnaissance flights, and became such a good pilot that later, after the Korean War, the CIA recruited him for the U-2 program. And after they were trained, then they would go back in the Air Force, but still fly the U-2s. And Chuck Maltzby, another pilot. Now, Chuck was in the Korean War, but he was a fighter pilot, and he was shot down by the Chinese. And he said that during his 3 years as a prisoner of war, he was in a 4-foot by 5-foot earthen hole. So imagine spending 3 years in an earthen hole. And then I was shocked to realize in the prisoner exchange, when he got out, I would have become a farmer or something like that. He goes back in the Air Force. And the CIA realizes what a great pilot he is. He was a Thunderbird pilot. They recruit him for the U-2 program, and he becomes a pilot. And then President Kennedy, I knew he'd be a character in the book, but I didn't know to what level. And the reason why he becomes a major character in the book is he secretly audio taped every meeting he had on the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he never told the people that were in the room that he was recording them. So Nixon wasn't the only president that had secret tape recordings. Kennedy did as well. And again, that's the reason why he's a major character, because I could listen to those audio tapes, I could read the transcripts, and in some cases see these people arguing about the fate of the world. It's unbelievable. So after Steve Heiser gets those photos, and this is old-fashioned film, so they had to be analyzed. It took 24 hours to go through all the film, and Kennedy is told while he's having breakfast, and I wondered what would his first question be. Mine might be, how many missiles, or are they in Havana? But he said, when will they be operational? Because he wanted to get a rough time frame, perhaps, of how long he had to get them out of there. Because once they're operational, then the Soviets hold the key. They can just threaten us by launching them. His second question was, how do you know? I don't see any missiles in these photos. And the National Photographic Center, which was run by the CIA, and it was a secret building housed above a used car lot in Washington, D.C. The head of it assured Kennedy, he said, we can blow these photos up, and that's what we've been doing, Mr. President, back at the lab, and we can give you 100% assurance that there's nuclear missiles in Cuba. We can't tell you if the warheads are on them yet. From our early intelligence, it looks like the warheads are not on them, and so that becomes kind of Kennedy's, one of his main goals in the day one, is to find out, well, how fast could the warheads be put on them? Because that will basically take away some of his leverage and his options. So the photographic interpreters and the CIA tell him, we think about 2 weeks, maybe 12 days, they'll be operational. His next step is, who's going to be my team of advisors? And this was really interesting. He didn't just pick the National Security Council he kind of hand-picked people. He picked a few from the National Security Council. Then he picked some other people that came as a surprise to me, such as the head of the Treasury. And then as I studied it more, I realized he's picking people who have the best and the brightest minds. And he's picking people who are going to be really frank and honest with him and debate with him on different viewpoints. Because he doesn't want a bunch of yes men. He really wants to debate these options as they go along. And here they are in the meeting, and they don't know. I think Bobby probably knew. You see Bobby Kennedy standing up here. They don't know that there's 2 microphones in the bookcase recording everything they say. So there's the transcripts are about this thick in a book, covering well over 100 hours of these meetings. And you could see LBJ sitting down, kind of facing us in the back there. He was part of it. Kennedy's leaning over the table, and Bobby's at every meeting. Bobby's his right-hand man. He bounces every decision off Bobby in private. Those 2 were very close. So the first thing Kennedy says is, I want as many U-2 flights over Cuba as possible now to gather intelligence. And of course the military says absolutely. And in the first 2 days of these meetings, it seems clear that a consensus is forming to bomb the hell out of Cuba, to go in with a massive airstrike and hit every single missile and hit every military installation, maybe followed up with a D-Day style invasion. And so the next pilot to launch and go over Cuba, where basically you'll be putting your life at risk because we soon discover what we suspected, that there's surface-to-air missiles there, was Rudy Anderson. And he has a successful flight, and he comes back with more film, and it's bad news. It's not just the missiles in San Cristobal outside of Havana. There's missile sites all over Cuba, and they're protected by surface-to-air missiles. The Soviet installations are way more than our intelligence knew about. Again, we knew about the Soviet buildup in Cuba. We just didn't know they had nuclear weapons there. And so, when these U-2s were invented, and it was really quite remarkable. We talk about the construction and the invention and the test flights of these, because from the concept to the first useful flight was only 3.5 years. But one thing they realized is the wings are so big, and some of the fuel was in the wings. They were heavy, and they would scrape on the ground as the aircraft took off. So they came up with a simple idea: put these little detachable pogo sticks under them. As soon as it elevates, these things just drop away. And then when it lands, the wings are lighter because the fuel's been used. They don't need these. So it really is a remarkable invention, and believe it or not, U-2s are still in use today, despite having satellites and drones. Every year I read, they're going to retire the U-2 just one more week, and then I read, they're extending it for a few more months. So something about having the pilot in the aircraft is beneficial to the intelligence. So the Air Force decides we're going to move our best U-2 pilots down to McCoy Airfield in Orlando to get them closer to Cuba. So there's 11 pilots in total, and they're going to be the ones doing repeated runs over Cuba. Because, the one flaw with the cameras is it can't penetrate cloud cover. So you have to have a good weather report and then launch, and you'll be over Cuba in just 40 minutes. Start taking your pictures. Now, there's a funny story behind this slide. The crisis, we're probably in like day 5 or 6 of the crisis, and Kennedy is meeting with the Soviet foreign ambassador and the Soviet foreign minister, and the topic of Cuba comes up, and the topic of the Soviet military there comes up, and they assure him that, Mr. President, yes, we're in Cuba, but it's only for defensive purposes, and we don't have any offensive weapons, and certainly don't have any nuclear missiles. Kennedy knows they have nuclear missiles, but he can't say anything because he hasn't decided what to do for sure yet. He doesn't want to tip his hand. So after this picture was taken, these two guys leave, and Kennedy turns to Bobby and goes, "It was all I could do not to go to my desk, pull out the photos, and shove it under their face. I can't believe they lied to me right in the Oval Office." But at this point, he hasn't quite decided. But he has quickly come to a different conclusion to most of the advisors. Let's not do the airstrike first. Let's go with a blockade. And Curtis LeMay, the head of the Air Force and Strategic Air Command, those nuclear weapons in the air, is furious. Because he says, this is the time to strike. We have the element of surprise. And Kennedy goes, well, don't you think, the Russians will retaliate when we kill Russians? And LeMay goes, no. And Kennedy goes, why not? And LeMay goes, because we're stronger and they know it. Kennedy goes, well, I don't think so. I think they'll at least take West Berlin, if nothing else. And then later, they get into an exchange where LeMay is borderline insubordinate. He goes, at one point, he goes, what you're doing is worse than the appeasement of Munich. Kennedy lets that go. Then later, LeMay goes, Mr. President, you're in a bad fix. And Kennedy goes, what did you just say? And LeMay goes, I said you're in a bad fix. And Kennedy goes, well, you're in it with me. And he breaks the tension. And you see that quite often in these Kennedy tapes, that when things get to a boiling point, either Bobby or the president cracks a joke to break the tension. And yet he never kicks LeMay out of the room because he wants that differing viewpoint, even though he can't stand LeMay and LeMay can't stand Kennedy. The two people, they absolutely loathe each other. So Kennedy decides on the blockade. He does throw LeMay a bone. He says, hey, if they shoot down one of our U-2s, we're going to go in there and blast that surface-to-air missile site off the face of the earth. And then Kennedy goes on television. That big concern is the misunderstanding, lose control that I mentioned. Our military's on DEFCON 2, one level away from all-out warfare. If you ever want to listen to Kennedy's address to the nation, it's on YouTube. You just Google it. And I think he does a good job because he's very stern and he's somber, but he doesn't put the people in a panic, because he could have easily panicked the whole country, people running to grocery stores and breaking in. But he's very firm, and by the next morning when the Soviets respond, they say we're on the path to nuclear war. The anxiety level is through the roof. Different people I've talked to have different stories. One woman said as soon as Kennedy was done with his speech, my father went in the backyard and started digging a bomb shelter. Another one said, when I went to school that day, at the end of the day, the teacher said, there won't be any homework tonight because there may not be a tomorrow. Yeah, quite a thing for a teacher to say. But that's the level of anxiety there was. But I never came across all-out panic or anything like that. Now, the U-2s were supplemented by other aircraft such as Navy Crusaders, and there were a couple members of the audience and I talking that they had a relative who served and flew some of these low-flying aircraft. They would zip by at like 500 miles per hour, almost at treetop level, and incredibly at that speed they could still get good photos to supplement the U-2s, which could cover the whole island. And their photos were pretty darn clear. So you see here in that big tent in the center of the screen, that's housing a nuclear missile. And so our intelligence, as the days go on, is getting better and better. And we never quite learned the full scope of the Soviet buildup in Cuba, but we knew it was serious. For example, the one thing we never knew for sure was if the Soviets had tactical nuclear weapons, which are the ones you would use on the battlefield, and it turned out they did. They were ready to just wipe Guantanamo Bay off the face of the earth. So Adlai Stevenson is the one who has to go in front of the UN and say to the world, this is why we're doing the blockade. We have proof. And he's very dramatic about it. We put some of the exchange with the Soviet ambassador going back and forth. And, the whole world is tuned into this exchange because you have these nuclear superpowers going at it. And then they actually bring out the pictures to prove to the world about the nuclear missiles. And now it's Jerry's turn to fly. So we're well into the crisis. We're probably on, I think it's day 11. And Jerry's been told, fly the whole length of the island and photograph 4 different targets. And Jerry's flight is going well. It's a pretty clear day. He's getting the photos he needs. And over Banyes, Cuba, the last one, that's when trouble starts. The Soviets have been tracking him on the radar, and they decide to take action without any authorization from Premier Khrushchev. So just what he feared is happening. And they fire 2 surface-to-air missiles at Jerry. And he said to me that I could see them coming up in my rearview mirror. And I said, your plane has a rearview mirror? He goes, yep. He goes, I could see the contrails. And then he said, boom, you could see the starburst. And I would show him slides. I said, did it look like this? He said, well, at the beginning it does, but then as the shrapnel goes out, it looks like a star, pieces going in every direction. And I said, what did you do? And he said, I did what I'm trained to do, and that was bank the plane and get pictures. I said, but these missiles were coming at you. He said, yeah, but he said they were about a quarter to a half mile away. So I knew I had a couple seconds to get it on film. And he said, I flicked the switches on, got it on film, and then got the hell out of there. And then he lands in Orlando, and of course the CIA debriefs him, and he tells them what happens. Then he tells his fellow pilots. And the story's so dramatic that I decided to open up the book with this story. You know how some books jump ahead and they open up with something dramatic, and then you go back to the chronological order, building up to the steps. That's what I decided to do here, because Jerry being shot at is just, it's unreal that he survived, gets it on film. And then the next day is even stranger. He's walking out to his aircraft, and Jerry's last name is McElmoyle, and he hears somebody go, McElmoyle. He turns around, it's a 3-star general. He goes, yes, sir. He doesn't know who this general is, and he goes, I just flew down from Washington, D.C. We've analyzed your film, and there was nothing on it. And Jerry goes, sir, I'm certain I got those SAMs on film. The general goes, there was nothing on it, so we destroyed your film and we destroyed your intelligence report. And Jerry goes, I'm positive of what happened. And finally the general goes, do you understand what I'm telling you? In other words, zip it up. So we never found out 100% why that happened. In the book, I speculate. I think someone at a very high level, and I don't know who, it could have been in the military, it could have been McNamara, didn't want Kennedy to know that the Soviets had shot at one of the U-2 spy planes, because Kennedy likely would have stopped all future flights, and the military needs this intelligence for the possible D-Day style invasion. So Jerry's report was destroyed, and you'll see how in the book later Jerry becomes a brigadier general and confirms everything that happens. In the Reagan administration, he was actually the general who teaches Reagan how to use the nuclear code in the briefcase, the football. So Jerry was a fascinating guy to interview and get to know for this project. So Jerry was shot at on a Thursday, and now, a couple days later, is when everything goes wrong. And this is kind of the height of the book. So what I thought I'd do is I'd tell you as much as I can without taking away all the element of surprise when you read the book. And there's 3 incidents in particular I want to I want to briefly discuss. And by the way, Kennedy's only 43 years old, so imagine that pressure. By day 13, I would have been a mess, just of insomnia alone with this pressure on you. But he was keeping to a schedule as best he could before he announced it to the public, so nobody, had a clue what was going on. The first incident is we told the Soviets that if we find one of your subs, through sonar approaching the blockade line, we're going to drop practice depth charges to let that sub know we've got you, and you better come to the surface and turn back. Now, on sub B-59, that's what this one is, we don't know if that message ever got to the commander, because we start dropping depth charges, and it's not just 1 or 2. He said it was 14 or 15. He thinks World War III has started. And he thinks because World War III has started, he doesn't have to wait for authorization from Moscow to respond. And I think he's got 12 torpedoes. Of the 12 torpedoes, one is called the Special Torpedo, which has a nuclear warhead on it. And the commander decides, I'm going to use it, the time is right. Now, just by coincidence, there's another commander on board, but he doesn't have control of the sub, so he can't take over. But it's this guy, Sergei Arkhipov, and he and the commander get into this big heated argument while the men are actually loading the nuclear torpedo into the firing tube. So you'll see in the book what happens with this argument way, 500 feet down at the bottom of the ocean. Now, Chuck Maltzby, remember he was the pilot shot down by the Chinese? You think, he's stationed in Alaska, what's he got to do with the Cuban Missile Crisis? But he plays a pretty big role. He's told, do a routine flight of testing for radioactivity in the air. And U-2s would do that. They'd put filters on board and get the air samples. But he's told, we want you to go all the way over the North Pole this time. So it's going to be a long flight. You're going to be in the air 8 to 9 hours. And they use the very best pilots for this because he's going to be in the air so long. And I was surprised to learn that when you're flying, say, over the North Pole, at night you're using celestial navigation. And even in the daytime, you're using a combination of things because you can't see any distinguishing features on the ground. You can't see a river. It's all ice. So they got everything planned out for him to do this, what they thought was a relatively routine flight, just longer than usual, when some bad luck hits. The Northern Lights. He can't see the stars to get his celestial navigation when he's approaching the North Pole, so he begins to get confused and lost, and he puts out a coded mayday that he's in trouble. There's no radio contact that far up. And he said, after being relatively lost for a while, I'm fiddling with my radio, trying to get the right frequency. And the way I knew I was in serious trouble was I hear Russian music. And then it gets even worse. He looks at his fuel gauge and he sees he's almost on empty. And going back to Chuck, he makes a decision. He goes, I am not going to be taken as a prisoner of war again. I know I'm over Russia. I'm sure the Soviets know I'm over Russia, which they did. They thought he might be the vanguard of our attack on the Russian homeland. And he decides to take the high risk of shutting down the aircraft, which means he's going to lose air pressure, which means if his pressure suit doesn't work right, he's going to be dead instantly. And he's not going to have these jet engines. He's going to be gliding in the aircraft. So I don't want to give it away, but everything is happening at once. You think this is out of a James Bond novel. Soviet MiGs are coming up to get him because he's gliding down. We're sending fighter jets to shoot down the Soviet MiGs, and Chuck Maltzby is in there, and everything is icing up and fogging up. He can barely see out the window. And the Russians think this is the start of World War III. So I won't go any farther because I want this to be a surprise when you read about it. But you'll think I'm making this up, but every word is true. It's been verified. Chuck Maltzby, for one, we used as the primary source. So he took off from Eisen Air Force Base, and his last radio contact was over Barter Island, and he gets lost somewhere approaching the North Pole, and he strayed so far to the west that he goes over the Chakataka Peninsula, and that's where, soon he picks up the Russian music and he knows he's in big trouble. And now this is very kind of a coincidental thing. At the same moment Chuck Maltzby's in trouble, Rudy Anderson launches for yet another flight over Cuba. He's already done 5. He volunteers for this flight because he wants to be known as the best reconnaissance pilot there is, because he doesn't want to be a fighter pilot. So they send him over an area similar to Jerry's, particularly near Guantanamo Bay, because we wanted to see what defenses there were around our big naval base. And the Russians are tracking him on the radar, and a Russian general turns to another. They're looking at this giant, they have this radar screen as big as this, and they can see him. And they go, "Our guest has overstayed his welcome." And the other general goes, "Let's get permission to shoot him down." So they call the Soviet Supreme Commander of troops in Cuba, and they can't get a hold of him because he's really sick. So they decide, you know what? All our intelligence says that the Americans are going to invade in the next day or two, which we were. They decide, we've got the authority to do this on our own. And so they tell the surface-to-air missile site at Banyas, same place where Jerry was shot at, try to take out target number 33, destroy target number 33. And Rudy's in a plane with U.S. Air Force markings. Kennedy said, "I don't want any CIA pilots flying, and I don't want any CIA markings on any aircraft. I want just Air Force," probably because of the Bay of Pigs fiasco. CIA wasn't too happy about that because they thought their pilots were just as good as some of these Air Force pilots they trained. But Rudy's Air Force all the way. And when he gets over Banyas, which is down by Guantanamo Bay, that's when the surface-to-air missiles are launched. Now, we don't know exactly what happens next, but I think I'm on the right track here. The missile comes up, and it's not a direct hit. But for a U-2, remember, they're such lightweight aircraft, all it takes is a little bit of shrapnel to hit it, and a wounded U-2 is going to come down. And we're pretty sure that's what happens, because if it was a direct hit, U-2 would have disintegrated. And through Jerry and the CIA, we have a photo of the aircraft after it's been hit on the ground, and part of it's still intact, which amazed me. So I immediately called up Jerry McElmoyle, my best contact, and said, "Jerry, how come this isn't in pieces, like as big as your hand and no bigger?" And he said, "Mike, if a U-2 is wounded," he said, "it comes down like a leaf falling from a tree, like this." And he said, first one wing will come off, then the other, then maybe the tail. And he said that Rudy Anderson's body was found dead in the cockpit, and he never got off a Mayday. There is an ejection seat. He never made any move to eject. And we think he was killed probably very, very quickly. So back at the White House, remember, Kennedy said if a U-2 shot down, we're gonna bomb Cuba. And he pulls Bobby aside and he goes, before we do that, go to the Russian ambassador and tell him, he doesn't use the word ultimatum, but it is an ultimatum. He says, if you don't get your missiles out of there, you know, within 24 hours, you're going to see military action. But he said, here's the deal that you can accept. You take your missiles out of Cuba, we will promise not to invade, and at a later date, with a gentleman's agreement, you can't make this public, we'll take our missiles out of Turkey, right on the Russian doorstep. So when Curtis LeMay hears that we're not going to go right in and bomb them, he goes nuts. And with his staff, he's calling Kennedy a chicken. They killed one of our pilots and Kennedy's doing nothing. But it turns out that Bobby has success. He goes to the Soviets, tells them basically this last chance. And Sergei Khrushchev said to me that when my father got the message, he jumped at the chance because he knew things were spinning out of control, just like Kennedy did. He knew about the shoot-down of Rudy Anderson. He knew about Chuck Maltzby straying into Soviet airspace and what all that caused. And Khrushchev immediately accepted the deal. So had Kennedy gone in and bombed the surface-to-air missile site, I think that would have been the first step to World War III. Instead, he did this last-ditch effort. So Kennedy goes on TV and he tells his advisors no gloating, because first we got to make sure those missiles come out of Cuba. And he tells the world, we've struck an agreement with the Soviets. We're getting to the last couple of slides. Rudy Anderson's body is returned by the Soviets, and when it's examined, he's still in the flight suit, the pressure suits. It was found that a tiny piece of shrapnel had penetrated the pressure suit. So probably that is what killed him. Maybe not the shrapnel, but not having the pressure suit when the aircraft started to break apart. You read in the book how tough it is on his wife, because first the Air Force, which was kind of cold and heartless, tells her, you and your children have to get off the base, probably because they don't want to bring the morale down. And then I discovered that a year earlier, she had a knock on her door, and it's two Air Force bigwigs and the chaplain, and they tell her, we regret to inform you your husband's been killed in a training accident. They'd gone to the wrong pilot. Rudy was fine. So this time when they go to her, and he really has been killed, she doesn't believe him, so she just goes through hell. And in the book, it was important that we put what happened to some of the wives who don't know fully what's going on with this U-2 program. So Kennedy does something classy. He decides, would be in November, to fly down to Florida, thank these U-2 pilots in person. And Jerry says, oh, I'm all excited, I'm going to get to meet the president. And then Jerry's told, hey, you're low man on totem pole. You have to stay in the hangar in case one of the president's entourage wants to see what a U-2 looks like. So Jerry says, there I am in the hangar. Kennedy's done his speech, shakes everybody's hands. But he said, then later, in comes the limousine. And he says, out comes Kennedy and his whole entourage. And Jerry's standing up by the cockpit, on the steps leading up. And Kennedy, he can hear Kennedy, and Kennedy goes to his entourage, you all stay here at the limousine. I want to talk in private to that young man. So we end the book with this half-hour conversation of just Jerry and JFK at the cockpit of the U-2 and what it is that they discussed in private. And so here's Jerry today. Looks like he could be my father. I know what I'll look like when my hair finally all goes. And I dedicated the book to both Jerry, all the U-2 pilots who put their lives on the line over Cuba, and especially to Major Rudy Anderson, the lone casualty keeping us all safe. Thank you very much. Thank you. And questions or comments you might have? We could take a couple, and then we could talk more during the book signing. Yes, sir. Right. Right. Exactly. When he nationalized the businesses, America went crazy. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah, he learned so much from it. And Kennedy's partly to fault for the failure of the Bay of Pigs because he withdrew air support at the last minute. Hmm. Yep. Yes. Right. Right. Yeah, it's yeah, exactly. Oh, to make it not look like an American ship? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and sometimes, I even wonder with the Kennedy assassination, did somehow all this play a role somehow? Because we're trying to assassinate Castro. We'll never know. Right, right. Yep. Hmm. Right. Thank you. Yeah, we do. One of the chapters is about the Bay of Pigs and above and beyond, just to give that background so you know what's leading up to this. Was there another question or comment? Yes, sir. You know, part of it was that we had suspended U-2 overflights over Cuba for fear that maybe one might be shot down. So we were doing periphery flights that were gathering some intelligence but not getting the pictures that we needed of these interior sites. So right under our noses, they're building it. Now spies were telling us, hey, something's going on. Big, huge trucks covered in canvas are moving into the countryside at night. All the farmers are being pushed out. And it was the head of the CIA at the time that was really starting to push Kennedy to let's get those U-2 flights back. We're going to have to risk our pilots. And so Steve Heiser was the senior U-2 pilot, and he was the first to go. And he's the one that got the flights. Unfortunately, Steve Heiser passed away just a couple years before I started the research because it would have been great to have him in person as well, besides Gary McElmoyle and a couple others. You're welcome. Well, I will be happy to sign books. Christmas is coming. You could do all your Christmas shopping. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was fantastic. It brought back a lot of memories. While you're all lining up to purchase books and then get them signed and so forth, if you would, you saw the survey sheets on on the chairs. If you could take and fill those out, and you can put them in that bluish green box over near the stage curtain over there. That would be fine. Want to thank you all for coming. Want to thank Sally Woodman, our program chairman, who puts these together. She's the one who gets us the grant money so that we can do these. And as I mentioned, this is our final presentation of the year. The next big thing we've got coming, and I know you're all excited about this, is the Fall Festival, which will be held as usual. I think this is our 13th consecutive year. It's our only fundraiser of the year. This is where we get all our money to do the things that we do. It's on October 19th, 4:30 to 6:30, as usual at the North Shore Bank. Used to be Merrimack Savings, now it's North Shore. Tickets are available now at the Town Hall, the Gale Library, and the Newton branch of the North Shore Bank. So if you have that night available, please buy a ticket and join us. There's wine, beverages, finger foods, and so forth, as well as artifacts and documents that we put out on display for everybody to look at. And if that night is not available, buy a ticket anyway. What the heck? Yeah. It goes to a good cause, okay? Thank you all very much for coming. We really appreciate your support.